In this lecture, I'll be discussing the Untitled Poem by NT Rajkumar, and we'll discuss some features of Dalit poetry and Dalit literature. My name is Piyush Chaudhary and I teach at Hansraj College at the Department of English. I welcome you all to this lecture. Now, let's begin first with some of the major features of Dalit literature. Firstly, it's the theme of protest because Dalit literature is not meant to educate but rather to agitate the masses and to bring them on the path of social change. Dalit literature is different from other forms of literature in that because it is not primarily meant for entertainment or for any aesthetic sense or for romanticizing, any particular tragedy or an event. Dalit literature is meant for carrying out social change. Dalit literature, basically, as we all know, it's the literary work that tries to call out the unjust practice of caste discrimination with a touch of reality and hardcore realism in order to bring about social justice through the power of literary words. So, therefore, Dalit literature is more or less a medium to educate, agitate, and invigorate the masses and to instill an emotion of social change in the readers. That is why there is a feeling of anguish, anger, rebellion, protest, revenge in almost all of Dalit literature. The protest and the feeling of anguish, anger, and revenge stems from what you can say years of suffering that Dalits had gone through in their social, political, cultural, and everyday life. And therefore, literature becomes a medium to let the world and the readers understand their pain and anguish. But why did I discuss all of this in relation to the poem by NT Rajkumar? This is because the poem by NT Rajkumar shows the theme of protest, rebellion, revenge, and retribution. In this particular poem, there is a feeling of anger and revenge in the author. And the author is an untouchable, but he is not in a helpless condition. Rather, he wants to seek forceful revenge on those who have marginalized his community. Unlike other pieces of literature, this poem does not infuse the feeling of pathos or pity, but rather a sentiment to seek justice and to seek revenge. That is why this poem has a very powerful tone as it depicts the anger, within the mind of the untouchable poet. There is no tone of sympathy, no pity, no pathos, and no sympathy. And the author does not want anyone to show sympathy towards him because he is a Dalit, but rather he just wants everyone to be a witness of his revenge, which he will inflict upon those who oppressed and violated him and his community. So there is a sense of Dalit consciousness or Dalit Chetna in this particular poem, and this makes it a very authentic description of Dalit consciousness, right? So hence clearly there is a theme of protest running in the poem. The poem can be placed firmly within the traditional Dalit literature, and the poem therefore becomes a weapon also in the fight against oppression. These ideas the poet will write, and I'll come to that. So, in short, the poem is a voice of a rebellious soul that wants to avenge itself and the humiliations and the pains and the oppressions inflicted on the untouchables by members of the upper castes, right? So, therefore, the feeling of revenge becomes representative of the condition of all Dalits. He is referring to the entire Dalit community as the cobra, which will strike the enemy, which will develop a terror in his heart if they oppress them, right? This is why toward the end of the poem the poet also says that I will be born again and I will terrorize you and I will follow you, right? He says that towards the end of the poem, right? So, and also he uses certain horrifying symbols of revenge, right? He has chosen the marginalized narratives of local folk deities, such as the Isaki, such as Kali, right? Which are traditionally not the Isaki is not the part of Hindu pantheon, but then Kali is the part of Hindu pantheon. So the poet says that these are the vengeful furies that will seek revenge from the oppressor. So the Untitled Poem by NT Rajkumar, it represents the anger against caste oppression, and it also represents a fight against injustice, right? And the poem does not show the poet as a defeated or an inert or a helpless or a lifeless subject. There is extremely a very very extreme note of protest in this poem, unlike the poem by F.M. Shinde, right? So the poem also has, as I mentioned, elements of folk culture. It has elements of animal imagery, natural imagery, jungle imagery is there, and several images of the folk deities are used by the poet, such as the Kali, the Isaki, Lord Shiva, and so on and so forth. Let's now go with the beginning of the poem and look at the first few lines of the poem. He says, dancing cobra eyes twist into the body, striking at the corner of the soul asleep, sticking one's tongue out on those full moon night. So in the very first stanza, in the very first line, the poet uses the image of cobra. It is a fearful imagery, a cobra who is ready to strike back. This is the poet's way of expressing his anger. So the first stanza evokes a sense of fear on the part of the poet, right? And each line of the stanza shows the poet in a fearful light, in an angry light, right? He says that the cobra's eyes are twisting and they will strike the soul of the oppressor. Who's the cobra here? Here he is the untouchable poet and the member of his community who will strike fear into the heart of the upper castes. So at the end of the first stanza, one can sense a feeling of violent anger in the poet, and he's ready to strike back at the oppressor. Right? Let's go forward to the second stanza. He says, "Drunk with saliva, sucked from the dripping mouth, my poisonous poetry scattered like fragrant flowers. Frightened to smell them alone, you bring to your aid those soaring birds of prey." So in this stanza, the poet is clearly aware of his poisonous poetry and the power of his poetry against social discrimination. He calls his poetry poisonous because his poetry has the power to go against the people in power. And his poetry has poison which will kill and demolish his enemies. Right? Then in the next line, he says that the upper castes are frightened to smell these flowers. And what are these flowers? These flowers are fragrant, but they contain poison. And the upper castes are frightened and afraid of reading his poetry, and therefore they decide to bring kites to their rescue. Kite is basically a kind of an eagle, of a somewhat similar genetic makeup. So he says because eagles and snakes are both staunch enemies of each other, isn't it? Right? So we can see that the poet claims that his poisonous and powerful poetry will strike terror in the hearts of the oppressors, and therefore they cannot face him alone. And therefore they bring eagles and kites to their rescue. Also, there is another important point regarding the poisonous poetry and the reference to the poetry being, poisonous. The poisonous poetry is not just poisonous for, because it's a theme of protest against the caste system, but also against the literary aesthetics. It's a very different poem. You see, it's untitled, right? It brings in a new literary tradition, right? It is against the aesthetics of the upper castes, of the traditional canonical literature. The kind of poetry written by NT Rajkumar is very unconventional. It is not meant for entertainment, firstly. Right? By calling his poetry as a poisonous poetry, NT Rajkumar is trying to challenge what you can say the norms of poems, the notion of normal poems written by the upper castes, the canonical poems written by the upper caste. So therefore he is also challenging the aesthetics of the non-Dalits, of the traditional literature, the non-Dalit literature. He's also challenging the dominant aesthetics, and by bringing his own unique ideas, his own unique images, and there is no tradition followed of giving a title to a poem, right? So basically, NT Rajkumar says that his poetry will be an antithesis to the poetry written by the upper castes. So therefore, can we conclude that this is an anti-establishment poetry in that sense? Of course, yes. This particular poetry deviates from the normative traditions of writing poetry, and therefore it will challenge all existing traditions of poetry because it is different, right? It is poisonous, and also it is written with, you can say, a sense of, with a zeal of social transformation, right? Let us now go forward. Denying Shiva this time, standing on the power of the god of anger, I tease the kites. I ask them, are you well? You fly away, disappear in the distance like a dot. So here the poet is saying that he's mocking the oppressors. He's teasing the eagles. He's teasing the kite and mocking his oppressors who are terrified of the poet. The kite bird is running away because the bird is also afraid of the poet's poisonous poetry, and the bird is also afraid of the cobra, right? Here the kite refers to the members of the upper caste, his oppressors. Let's now go on to the final stanza. I cannot touch the shadow of your wing. I will be born again and again as a devil, as a ghost, as Kali is Zaki, as the vengeful furies. I will terrorize you and I will follow you. So the poem ends here, right? So in this final third stanza, the poem ends not with pity, hopelessness, despair, pain, inertness, but rather with the promise of revenge. The poem ends on a forceful note, and brings in horrifying personalities who are, part of the mythology and are taking revenge on the oppressor. He takes the idea of the goddess Kali. He takes the idea of, Kali, who is a folk deity, right? He also brings in the image of Shiva, who is a folk deity. The Kali represents revenge, Shiv represents destruction, because they are out there to punish the oppressors and those who spread evils in the world. The image of Shiv and Kali are tribal gods of destruction. Basically, they are tribal gods of destruction. And so there is also an element of religious folk poetry in this particular poem that we just now read. The poet says that he will come again as these vengeful, revenge seeking souls, right? So, as Kali, as Isaki, not part Isaki is also, another revenge seeking soul. So it is very evident that the poet is in anguish, but he's also in a he's not in a self pity mode. He's rather in a very vengeful mode, in an aggressive mode. On the contrary, the oppressors and those who are from the upper castes, they are in an uncomfortable state. They are frightened, of the poet. They are afraid of his poetry because his poetry has, you can say, a transformative power. And that is the reason why Dalit literature is known as poetry of protest, right? So, therefore, in the beginning, I have already mentioned that the poet uses animal imagery, such as the imagery of a cobra, to show anger. But despite the eagle being strong, the poet, who is the cobra, he's resilient, he's ready to fight. And he's not fighting for his own self, but rather for his entire community. And that is the Dalit community. Hence, we discussed a very powerful, a very evocative, a very jolting poem, I would say, written by NT Rajkumar. The poem is untitled, there is no title to it, but that's okay because the purpose of the poet is not to give titles to his poetry, but rather to use his poetry to bring about social change, right? He is therefore much more interested in infusing a sense of rebellion against the aesthetics of upper castes, and that is why he has not given any particular title to this poem. In a way, this is a very subtle way of going against the established conventions of poetry and against the tradition of the upper castes. And therefore, from the beginning till the end, the poem is filled with and replete with themes of protest and oppression. So I hope that the readers were able to understand the features of Dalit poetry and they were able to associate this poetry, with these points which I discussed with the poem by NT Rajkumar. I will now end the lecture. I hope the readers enjoyed the poetry as much as I did delivering the lecture. Please raise your doubts, suggestions, comments, any other queries in the comment section below. And don't forget to share the video with others who are preparing for their exams. I will see you shortly in the other parts of readings on Indian diversity and literary movements in the coming days. Thank you. Goodbye. Jai Hind.